Hello everyone, I'm Mark, and this is Several Books. Today we're looking at William Burroughs. William Burroughs is an interesting writer in the history of American literature. He's probably the most aggressively experimental, widely read writer in American letters. He is a beatnik writer, although oftentimes people who are into Burroughs, like myself, tend to stress that he's a bit different than many beatniks. When I think of William Burroughs, I think of somebody a bit like Alfred Jarry, the French writer, and I tend to think of Joyce, and basically what I think of is somebody who's kind of off doing his own thing. A writer who I think is interesting in relation to Burroughs is the writer Paul Bowles. And Paul Bowles lived in Tangier for years and in Morocco, and he basically acted as a bit of a spiritual guide, both Bowles and Burroughs, for different writers. Tangier, when this was occupied by writers of the American bent, was a international hub. Now when we think of Tangier, that area of the world, things are a bit different. So that was 70 odd years ago, the 50s and so on. So things are a bit different now. Talking about Burroughs, it's impossible to discuss the writing without mentioning both his homosexuality and his drug abuse. Much of his writing was influenced by his experience on drugs, and so he has a bit of he gives an impression that is easy to misunderstand. If you're reading a cut-up book by Burroughs the first time and you just hear that he has a history of drug dependency as he did, you might think that he was not capable of writing a conventional novel. The reality is that he did write two conventional novels while on drugs, and he wrote an essay collection. He did not necessarily condone the use of all of the drugs that he did take for other writers, and it is hard, though, to discuss him without first pointing out that this is a big flaw in him. He had issues with drugs. It's not right to say that his writing was the product of his drug abuse. When we look at his style and the things that he accomplished in a literary fashion, we can say that Kathy Aker, who oftentimes accomplished similar things and took those extreme styles even further, she did not condone drug use in general. So let's start with William Burroughs. To start with William Burroughs, I'm going to group his essay collection with his realist novels. Burroughs has very distinct periods, and he seems to have more periods than other writers, in large part because he was trying so many different writing styles, and he lived in many different locations, having very strange, unusual experiences relative to the normal person. In large part, the ability to make all of his indulgences was because of an enormous inheritance. So Burroughs was a rich kid who went to Harvard. There's no escaping that. So when we talk about Burroughs, we first got the adding machine. My question was when to bring this up in relation to his other work. This is an essay collection. It has a very decent introduction into the writing of the book and how it was composed by another writer. And the essays do at times rely on Burroughs' cut-up technique. So it was not something solely used for fiction. He elaborates a bit in here the mystical ideas that he had related to his compositional strategy. What we get in here is his meetings with Samuel Beckett, who surprised me that he had ever met Beckett. We get a brief reflection on Proust. He talks about Hemingway and F. Scott Fitzgerald. He doesn't mention Faulkner that much, if at all. I can't remember him mentioning Faulkner at all. So that's a bit of a surprise to me because Faulkner was so experimental. That said, this is an essay collection. It's not the best essay collection, but it's an essay collection. Burroughs' ideas and opinions were often very similar to the sci-fi world opinions. We get a lot of mystical stuff a la Philip K. Dick, and we get some strange ideas about the way that language works, for instance. The next two books that we're going to talk about are Junky and Queer. Junky was the first of the two realistic novels. It is basically a pulp novel. When I say pulp novel, what I mean is a certain sensibility and kind of take to the publishing world. We get lurid details of a life that is not conventionally lived, a very wealthy man who is indulging in various types of drug use. In Junky, Burroughs does not discuss his homosexuality. He does, however, discuss going across different borders and into Mexico and back to the U.S. It seems, based on Junky, almost as if whenever something very bad happened to Burroughs, his way of handling the world, when we look at his biography and the book, was to simply leave the country. So if something bad happened, or he was running afoul of somebody, he could simply just leave. He had that financial backing. We don't get lengthy reflections on wealth, however. The book really does read kind of like a conventional beatnik book. It's not a great novel, but it's interesting in the history of William Burroughs. Queer was the next book, and Queer was not published when it was written. It is a realist narrative. It's only about 100 pages. One thing the introduction points out is that when Burroughs wrote the book, his publisher at first thought that if he published it, the book would wind up with both of them going to prison. The book is not, by today's standards, extreme at all. And the gay relationship in the book is a very conventional sort of romance that we might find elsewhere. If you're to read, for instance, James Baldwin's Giovanni's Room, I would say that that book has more in terms of controversial material than is actually in Queer, which is very unusual. You would expect from Burroughs kind of the most extreme at the time. The book is good. I'm not surprised that it was made into a movie. I have not seen the movie, but it's not my favorite. And as I said, compared with other things coming out today, it remains interesting primarily because it is an American representation of queer fiction. I do wonder what the word queer meant when the book was published in comparison to the way that we use it today. It has since been reappropriated. Some part of me wonders if the only reason why it might have been controversial on its face is that the title would have been taken as something so abrasive. The next book we have is Naked Lunch, and Naked Lunch is a cut-up book. The book is mainly about a location, the way that a Hieronymus Bosch painting is primarily about a location. In a Hieronymus Bosch painting, there are multiple little creatures running around a great map, and the real painting is of all of the different interactions. When we see Naked Lunch, what we get is Interzone, which is the Tangier in Morocco, where Burroughs was living at the time. We see various types of drug use. We see prostitution. We see murder. We see a grand list of satires. The book is not, to me, something that you go into hoping for a conventional novel. It surprises me sometimes that it was so widely read, because it is a montage, and only seeing the surface impressions of a very surrealist landscape is a bit strange. It's not something that I would imagine people reading the way I read it, just kind of like it's a great story. I've read all of Burroughs mostly, or all but maybe a novel or two, and things that are out of print. And I think that it's a well done book, but it does raise questions about composition. It's important to comment that when Burroughs wrote it, he was under the influence, and at a time even denied that it was his composition. I believe that Ginsberg and Kerouac actually assembled the notes into the coherence that we have of the book. The next section that we're going to look at with Burroughs is the beginning of the trilogies. The first trilogy is called the Cut Up Trilogy, and it's The Soft Machine, The Ticket That Exploded, and Nova Express. Altogether, if you look at this looks like it's probably a pretty hefty book, 1,000+ pages. Each of these books contains a great introduction and endnotes. So in reality, if you're just trying to read Burroughs, I didn't read all of the endnotes, and I don't know if I read all of the introductions. I imagine I did. But what I'm saying is that the books total about 600 pages. The writing is very quick. You will read the books the way that you read kind of pulp science fiction novels. In many ways, Burroughs was a pulp science fiction novelist. He certainly didn't stray from that field in conventional ways through realism, which is what we see, for instance, from writers like Gabriel Garcia Marquez, or even certain Philip K. Dick novels, where he seems to be bridging a realist work into science fiction. We're not seeing that magical sense. What we're getting with Burroughs is just very much straight, pulpy sci-fi. The thing that's so strange about Burroughs is the cut-up method, and at the end of this video I'm going to discuss that briefly. But we get very little drug use. Burroughs is associated with his drug use. In reality, most of his fiction tends to stray from that stereotypical Burroughs novel image where all of the characters are running around intoxicated. What doesn't stray from the image is that beginning with this trilogy, we see a large amount of homosexual sex and the indulgence of men in other men. It becomes very, very clear that Burroughs was a guy who loved dudes. That's just part of what Burroughs was. I think we begin to see Burroughs' fascination with J.M. Barrie and Peter Pan as a story in these books, but it doesn't come through very strongly until towards the end. One thing that you will find about Burroughs is that almost all of his characters are men. There are very few women. I think there are entire books without a woman character. The thing that's so unique about Burroughs, or that is unique about Burroughs, is the cut-up method. Although we're getting very pulpy sci-fi type subject matter at times, mixed with a pornographic sensibility, the rhythms of the speech, the rhythms of the writing, and the way that he writes is clearly unusual. It can be incredibly beautiful, and it can be quite unexpected. I forget in which one of the Cut Up trilogy the event occurs, but there is an occurrence in the Cut Up trilogy where a man is walking around in a jungle or a swamp of some sort, and I believe it's in Mexico, and the man is evacuating his bowels. It's a incredibly surreal, dream-like event. This man is outside suffering, wandering around, deeply sick, looking at the world around him. He's looking at the sky and the jungle, and he's hearing the sounds of bugs, and at the same time his body is expelling things. And there's no plot connection to the event that I can recall at all. I don't think there's any sort of plot with it. It's just this occurrence that happens. It's very long. I think it's something like 30 pages. And it's surprisingly one of the more beautiful things that I've read in the past few years. I came to Burroughs somewhat recently. I had read certain books before, but I actually read the bulk of Burroughs more recently in the past few years, and it's really it's quite a thing to read. Aside from that, Burroughs begins to explore his mysticism some, and he talks more about his fascination with pseudosciences and ways of reading. We do see mention to orgones, which are something that Wilhelm Reich theorized about. Wilhelm Reich was a leftist psychoanalyst or doctor of some sort, and had a lot of very strange mystical theories about sex as a cure for ailments, and from what we can tell, non-existent particles that would interact with the body. So we've covered now the realist novels, the Naked Lunch, and the first trilogy. The second trilogy that Burroughs wrote is not really as much of a trilogy. It contains Wild Boys, it contains Exterminator, and then there's a book that's not even in print anymore. I have a copy of it. It's called Port of Saints. I'm going to talk a moment about Port of Saints, but don't feel bad, you're not missing the bulk of Burroughs. So it is important to understand Burroughs as a trilogy writer as far as the Cut Up trilogy goes and the last 3 books of his career goes. That said, I'm not positive whether this was intended in any way to be a trilogy, this middle trilogy, but what we can do is start looking at Wild Boys, which is probably the purest example of the interest in the Peter Pan story. Essentially, Wild Boys are like the Wild Boys of Peter Pan, the Lost Boys, and it's a group of say late teens, 18, 19. I think the youngest is 16 or 17. Wild Boys is a narrative that's written in a bit of a cyclical structure. It kind of spirals inward. And so when you hear people discuss the events in the novel, it is, because it's Burroughs, a bit difficult to square with what your reading experience is. So much of the novel is diverse characters who have their own names, but are very little aside from a very cartoonish description and a name. It's a very flat description. This is done very intentionally, it appears. He's not developing characters, he's developing a world. So for people interested in world building, Burroughs is a primary example of how that can be done in a literary fashion. It's very experimental. It is using the cut-up method. There are many scenes of gay sex. If I remember right, the Wild Boys' uniform of sorts is rocket-powered roller skates and a thong as well as a weapon. When the book was written, it was very influential for David Bowie. And believe it or not, the pop band Duran Duran, who we wouldn't associate with this, had been planning to assist on a soundtrack for a gay porn film about the book. The second book in the mid-career trilogy is Exterminator. I know from reading Adding Machine that the book was not really planned. Similar to Naked Lunch, the book was very much assembled from things that Burroughs had written and collected. Unfortunately, it doesn't have the coherence of scene or the coherence of scenery, of world, of land, interzone that Naked Lunch has. So I don't have a huge amount to say about this, except that I read it in a few hours. It's a quick read, and if you like Burroughs in general, you're kind of going to like all of Burroughs, but this is his worst book. I'm just saying that definitively. I've read 13 books by William Burroughs, and this is the bottom of the barrel. The last book in the mid-career trilogy is Port of Saints, which, as I said, is not available widely. I think you can definitely find copies used online. I did mine. It's a little expensive. I didn't pay $50 for the book, but I paid more than I would have typically paid for a novel like that. But I was determined to read all of Burroughs, and I had the last trilogy waiting. I wanted to read that first. We have characters in Port of Saints who appear in other Burroughs work. So I think in Wild Boys we might see characters who are very briefly in the Cut Up trilogy, but what I will say for certain is that there are characters from Wild Boys who appear again and again in Burroughs' work. The interesting thing about Port of Saints is that it's very autobiographical. I don't remember if St. Louis is specifically mentioned, but we do have almost as much autobiography in terms of the content as we get in a book like Junky. The difference is that we do have these characters who are, for all intents and purposes, magic or from a sci-fi realm transported to the real world. The book, however, is told in the cut-up method. It's interesting to see that there are likely sections from Wild Boys that are repurposed and changed, and we wind up with a totally new overall story. Burroughs' last trilogy is, for me, kind of the best Burroughs. My opinion on this is not going to be widely shared. I think it's his more accessible work, while at the same time showing off the cut-up method. He does reuse sections of other books, kind of repurposed and cut up and changed. The book is really a retelling of not Dante's Inferno, but the Divine Comedy. Cities of the Red Night is the first, and Cities of the Red Night, it deals with 9 different cities that are very clearly hearkening back to Dante's Inferno. The book is not quite as quote-unquote literary as something like Thomas Pynchon, but I would say that in a book like this, we're beginning to see a shift. I mean, it's the end of Burroughs' life, so it's not a completed kind of becoming of a writer like Pynchon. Burroughs is always more science fiction pulp rooted than somebody that literary. But we are definitely seeing something unique, and it's certainly an interesting sci-fi story. It deals with a virus, and the book was written in the early 80s, so it's a question of whether Burroughs was writing about language, which he often referred to as a virus, or if he was writing about the AIDS epidemic and its start, and if that was being reflected in Cities of the Red Night. The Place of Dead Roads is the second book in the last trilogy. In my opinion, this is the most fun book that he wrote. It's funny because if somebody were to ask me for a Burroughs, if you go into a bookstore, and let's say all of Burroughs is on a bookstore shelf, which I've never seen, but we can imagine, and you ask me, who's read essentially all of Burroughs, what book should I read? I would tell you to read The Place of Dead Roads. The Place of Dead Roads is there is a narrative. It simultaneously contains the cut-up method, and the overall story is just bizarre. Essentially, a cowboy who is heroin addicted and gay, and both indulges in drug use and gay sex in the narrative, goes to, I think it's Mars or Venus. I'm pretty sure it's in some strange vehicle. And there he basically has to save the world from alien invasion. The aliens include dwarf aliens that have enormous caterpillars growing out of their foreheads. So I've never read a story like that before. I read this and I was just like, wow, I really don't even know what to say there. That's just something totally different. So if you're asking me for what is the best Burroughs book for somebody who's never read Burroughs, this is the strangest and at the same time most coherent. So I would recommend this. The last Burroughs book is The Western Lands. I think this might actually be his best book at the Hieronymus Bosch style crafting of a landscape. There are allusions to pop culture that appear that are somewhat hidden. For instance, he's got something based on Mick Jagger in here. But really what we're talking about is that this book is written as if it's a sort of holy book, reflecting on the land of the dead, really. And at the same time, we're getting so many different characters. When we read this book, we see Bosch the clearest, and it's the culmination of the type of landscaping and landscape narrative that avoids plot of all of his books. What I'm going to do now is rank Burroughs, and we're going to do the conventional S through F tier. For the S tier, what I'm going to go with is the last trilogy, and I'm going to go with the first trilogy, the cut-up trilogy. There are people who are going to say things about the last trilogy inclusion, that it's not as good as his other work, that he should have, gone free rein from the narrative structure. However, I think that he's actually accomplished it well. Although Burroughs is in some ways strongest when he's completely abandoning plot and story and is really only giving us beautiful language and bizarre scenes, his handling of the pulp style narratives is expert. Reviewing the final trilogy is on a par with any other sci-fi great that I've read. I'm not the widest reader of sci-fi. I think that his late trilogy is great, and it's almost as good, if not better, or at least as good as the first trilogy. So let's talk about A tier. A tier books, what I'm going to go with are Naked Lunch and I'm doing this mostly to show deference to any Burroughs reader who might be watching this. I understand that this is the one that introduced basically everybody to Burroughs, and there are some of the funniest parts in it, and the most absurd. But I just honestly am. For me, this is probably more B tier, but I'm showing deference. Lots of people like this. The other A tier book that I'm going to mention is Wild Boys, and this is such a short novel, and it's so Burroughs that if this is the kind of thing that you're interested in, reading Burroughs, this is like the second book you should read. My first book that I probably recommend is The Place of Dead Roads, but I'd recommend reading the full trilogy, and I understand that if somebody hands you a full trilogy, you might not want to read it. The reality is, though, is that you can read so many of these things out of order, it shouldn't matter. Finally, for our A tier, I'm going to go with the out-of-print Port of Saints. And the reason I like that book so much is when it contains realism, we're seeing realist stuff in a style that's very cut-up. The only writer I know who approaches the cut-up method with that level of realist intent, granted I don't know many cut-up artists, is Pascal Quignard, who is a French writer. And Pascal Quignard wrote a series of books called Le Dernier Royaume. And Le Dernier Royaume is, I don't know if it's actually cut up, I don't think it is, but so much of the book is told in these aphoristic styles that are not organized by our conventional ideas of narrative. So what we kind of get with Le Dernier Royaume is something like a historical fiction cut-up, whereas William Burroughs is a science fiction cut-up. It's these little sections, and it's a very interesting book. If you're curious about Pascal Quignard, The Roving Shadows is available in English. So it's a bit of something of a like mind artistically to Burroughs. He's a very different person than Burroughs. But there is some type of kinship between The Roving Shadows and Burroughs, especially something like Port of Saints. So we have a B tier, and where we're going with the B tier is I'm going to try to represent everything, so I'm going to put Junky at a B-C tier. I'm going to have this on the chart between B and C. I'm going to put C tier is only Queer and The Adding Machine. And I think Queer is not as good a book as it's being made out to be, and that if you're looking for gay representation in fiction that is American classic fiction, there are better narratives. I would definitely point to Giovanni's Room, which many people would be aware of, I assume. Maybe that they'd be less aware of, I would mention Falconer by John Cheever. And if you're looking for something a little bawdier, you might consider a book like Myra Breckenridge by Gore Vidal as a classic American novel. That has a strange kinship, in my opinion, to certain works by Kurt Vonnegut. So again, this is not a bad book, but I don't think it's as good as it's made out to be. I think people like it because it's Burroughs, and they hear Burroughs' mystique, the drug abuse, the world traveling, the decadence. But in reality, for me, Burroughs is cut-up method and in a fixation on the idea of lost boys from Peter Pan. Burroughs is not a realist novel that he wrote and wasn't published, and so on. The D tier is Exterminator. So I don't think this is a good book. I read it in a few hours. It's a very easy read. It's like reading easy Burroughs, easy Philip K. Dick, easy J.G. Ballard, but it's just not his. It's not his best. The introduction in the adding machine talks about how that book was assembled, basically slapdash, and it was in some ways not really a coherent project. I want to talk for a moment about the cut-up method. William Burroughs' cut-up method was not a method of haphazard collection. He would cut up various lengths of text from books and piece them together. When I was first introduced to the cut-up method, because people talked about chance in the cut-up method, I thought that it was all just random. I did not understand when I was first introduced to the idea of the cut-up method when I was much younger, when I was first introduced to Burroughs, that Burroughs would actually work very closely with his collages. So he would write things out, piece other things in and together, and if there was a way that he thought he could improve a section, he would edit the section. He didn't leave it to chance. Although he pieced things together, what was never explained to me and what I had to learn from reading all of Burroughs was that the focus was not just simply random events. The random events were not random. They were events that were being structured in order to create a landscape. So we're getting a sci-fi scape, we're getting a horror scape, or a comedy sci-fi scape, or a porno scape. And so it's important to me to make this clear, because I want to make sure that anybody reading Burroughs who might decide to write or something or try a cut-up method understands the way that it was done, although there was chance involved. And Burroughs did compare himself, I believe, to Jackson Pollock at some point. There were edits going on. It wasn't just a disorganized mess. And when there isn't coherence in Burroughs, it's usually rooted around the idea that he's creating a landscape rather than a plot. What we get with Burroughs, because of his style, is these beautifully crafted landscapes, these intensely surreal images and events, but the idea of plot is almost just non-existent. And so it's not until the last trilogy that we really see that come back into his writing at all, and even in his last trilogy, it's not emphasized. I want to say, just because I frequently do say it, that I'm wearing a Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep t-shirt. I don't know if you can see that super well. It looks like you can. So what we've got is the android down here and the electric sheep up here. Now, I'm not wearing this just because Burroughs was a sci-fi writer, but it's certainly part of the reason. Alright guys, I've gone through Burroughs. I've mentioned everything that I'm aware of that he's published. It's easily available, and even one book that is out of print. I think there was either one or two other fictional works that were published in his lifetime but that are no longer in print that I haven't read. The one that I'm thinking of was like a movie script about a gangster of some sort. I forget exactly what, but that's one I haven't read. That said, everything that you can find by Burroughs easily without having to go to used bookstores or searching them online, of course, it's not terribly difficult to do that. I've reviewed, and as I said, I found Port of Saints very easy. I think I paid like $20 or $25 for it, so it's not going to break the bank, but it's not the cheapest book either. If you're going to read it, you're going to read it. So I wish you the best of luck on that. Alright guys, that's been several books, and you have a great day. Please like and subscribe. Thanks. Bye-bye.